Dr. J and AT, just to get us started, I thought maybe you could tell us all here tonight, like, why did the two of you, to comment individually, why did you get into social activism writing, and what's that journey taught you along the way? So whoever would like to go first, love to hear your thoughts.
Yeah, I can start. My start with social activism writing actually began when I was in high school. I have a very vivid memory of walking up to my principal and asking, what are we doing for Black History Month? To which he responded, Which month is that again?" And obviously, we were in February, and he had absolutely no clue, what the month was about or what Black history really meant for me and for a lot of people in my class. So I wrote my first op-ed ever, which was called "Why St. Peter's Prep Doesn't Care About Black History Month." And from there, I saw both people who were encouraged by what I wrote, but also people who were upset. And it was my first experience really understanding that, the word is really powerful, especially when you have to, speak up about something that is controversial. And I didn't really get a chance to delve back into that until college. And then after, when Trump won, I, decided that I needed to do something. I need to contribute in some way. And that's when I began writing op-eds again. And the first op-ed that I wrote was actually a letter to my nephew, who was born the night Trump was elected. So, you can imagine, the uproar and the general energy in the room when more states were turning red than blue. And about an hour after we were starting to see that Trump might win the election, I get a call that my sister was going to labor and that my nephew was on the way. And imagining, this Black boy born into this country that seemed to not care at all about Black people was just very, very conflicting for me. And I wanted to find a way to express that. And, I had always written poetry my entire life. Oftentimes, I'd write things that no one would read. And I found that with writing op-eds, especially around activism, there's a huge audience and a hunger for, the written word that can help just pull at people's heartstrings while also pushing forth an agenda and a political belief. So I, think about high school. I think about my nephew every time I write, and so much has changed, since then. But what's remained constant is, that response from people, that hunger, that appetite for people to engage with their work has definitely remained true.
Thank you, first of all, for the question, for the opportunity to speak, and to be here with you all. And thank you, AT, for what you shared. It really has me going back to when I first began this kind of writing, which actually was for me as a teenager. I joined Urban Word NYC, a youth spoken word and hip hop organization in New York City. And this out of school organization created a context for youth agency and leadership, but particularly for young people who were interested in the craft of spoken word, to speak back against a social reality that has been perpetuating harm through injustice. And that's just not something that was available to me in school, right? Like, school was very much a place of just being able to document, to ingest and regurgitate knowledge. And in the there was this sense that there was this invitation actually for young people to take up space in platforms that invited social critique, that invited an interpretation of a world that had been acting upon us in ways that are not just. And so for me, that was very much where it started. And once you have that invitation opened up, start to ask these questions, you can't stop. That the momentum of that propelled me to my into my doctoral work and into continuing to think about the relationship between in the particularly Black and Brown voices and social justice in this world. And that became all sorts of my scholar activism for years to come.
Thank you both for kind of getting us started here. And we're actually going to stay with you for a little bit longer, Dr. J, because, in doing research about both of your work to prepare for tonight, one of the things I looked at, read a couple of your things, and I saw some of your talks. And I think at the heart of a lot of your talk is about this this idea, like this, what are the stakes around racial change? And in particular, you call out the idea of losing the ability to raise the visibility around Black brilliance, especially as it makes itself evidence in Black youth. So I'm wondering if you can talk about the ways that you see attempts to limit or remove that brilliance, and what are some of the key things that you'd point to that shows brilliance that can happen despite, or maybe even sometimes because of certain types of obstacles?
Yeah, absolutely. Like my work is very much centered, like people, when you do work of injustice, there's often this thought that the work of injustice is about begging for a seat at someone else's table because we just like need to belong to someone else. And as a people, I really believe that Black people across the African diaspora are so brilliant and beautiful and magical in our own right, and that stifling that and limiting that in any way, institutionally and individually, just causes harm to everyone, right? Like we lose out on the genius of what is possible because we are so centered on white supremacy as a society. And so just even what I just spoke to you about, that same space as a young person that was, you know, predominantly Black and brown young people, it was such a brilliant space of genius where our linguistic dexterity and power, our voices, our culture, nothing was constrained or circumscribed the way that it is in traditional schooling context. And so we thrived across Broadway stages, in Madison Square Garden, in the Apollo Theater, on HBO, right? Like these are the spaces that genius, not pained and restrained by the limitations we typically impose on them, that's what it evolved into, right? And so for me personally, in the work that I do right now with young people, particularly Black youth, what that looks like is the way that Black youth are told necessarily that essentially that when they enter the space of school or institutions to prepare for college and career readiness, that they need to take off and erase and abandon the language practices, the cultural practices, the things that make them magic are the things that don't fit into to what we've standardized and located as valid intellect in the rigid space of schooling and career context, but it is the same thing that we co-opt in our for mass appeal, right? Like we'll see across social media, we'll see across mass media, the way that all kinds of the magic from Black culture, it can't be contained, right? And so I'm very intentional about disrupting the false binary between schooling and education, and saying like, education is happening anyway. This is happening anyway. Resistance and resilience and power and brilliance in Black communities is happening anyway. And the culture of hip hop in its rawest form is one example of that. The way that culture pushes and just adds so much color and depth and continued social critique to our reality, but also aesthetically in our dress, in the way that in our art, in all of the contributions that you see across the African diaspora. These are contributions that are consistently refused by institutions that continue to center white middle class values. And so for me, that's what it's about. It's about not saying that we're begging for, you know, some seat at some table, but understand there's brilliance and genius here that the whole world is being robbed of at every moment.
And I feel like, Dr. J, you know, some of what you're talking about is some of what I want to bring AT back in the picture of, is that, you know, in some respects, you're talking about a figurative, but like cultural policing around Black mobility, excellence, magic, like you talked about too, but just our ability to kind of show up in spaces fully formed and allowed to be so. You know, AT, I was looking at your most recent piece in Slate that touches on policing in a much more like literal sense. And in particular, it's focused on the idea of like the defunding campus police as an institution inside of college and university institutions. I think so much of what you talk about too is interesting because you do the thing that I think a lot of us have to do, which is ground these things in very personal, real experiences, but then still have to zoom out and talk about the wider spread implications of it. I would love for you to like one just comment for people who might be unfamiliar with the piece. You just kind of give a highlight around what this piece was particularly about. But then I'd also love for you to kind of share with folks like what some of your reflections are in writing it about potential solutions around defunding campus police as well.
Yeah, absolutely. So this piece was written actually a few months ago after George Floyd was killed and protests began. And I noticed that there was a big blind spot in conversations around police brutality, which was that police have a huge, huge presence on college campuses. And they often, really are overlooked in terms of that scrutiny that we're applying to state and local police officers. So I have had personal experiences where I've been discriminated against by police officers. The story that I wrote in particular was a time when I was in the backyard of an event happening on a college campus with friends, and a police officer walks up to me and says, "I saw you walking off the street, come with me." That was it. Grabs me, starts to escort me outside of the party before my friends came and showed them I was on the RSVP list, and cleared me of any accusations that he had. And at that moment, I walked around my campus, I walked around other campuses afraid, not afraid of other students or of community members, but of the campus police, the people who were there to protect me, in theory. And right now, what we're seeing across the country exists as a microcosm on college campuses. So right now, there are probably thousands of police officers across campuses. I think 86% of campuses have some type of college police force. Oftentimes, those police forces are directly tied to the city police force, and the campus police officers often have jurisdiction both on and off that campus. So we have seen campus police officers both shoot innocent and kill innocent people who are off that campus. And we're also seeing those same gaps in terms of lack of training, lack of accountability, and over weaponization, over use of excessive force. And because of that, the exact same principles that we're applying to the Black Lives Matter movement across state and local police officers needs to be taken seriously on college campuses. And both the experiences of people on those campuses, like myself, need to be reduced, but also we need to ensure that students feel safe. The psychological impact of seeing Black bodies on the ground, attacked, harassed, killed, is already so much for any individual of color to deal with, especially Black people. But when it's happening right on your campus, there's a clear mental health impact. There's an impact on students' ability to succeed in school as a result. So that policing that Dr. J has talked about in both the literal and figurative sense is something that needs to change, and it starting with every police department, but especially on college campuses.
Tre, if you don't mind.
Yeah, that's actually,
No, yeah, because that's resonating with me so much, because I'm thinking about the hypervisibility of how we are able to see the policing of Black bodies, and we don't often see the policing of Black identities that happens every single day, right? And it's what I'm speaking to, right? Like, so the policing of language, the policing of our culture. So we have in California, they had to pass the Crown Act, like legislation had to be passed for our hair to be allowable within institutional spaces, right? Like the policing of Black bodies just goes back to so much colonial and race and logic around racism, imperialism, American chattel slavery, that it's not just about what we do with Black bodies, but it's how we constrain Black expression as well, right? There are young people in schools who, we know that there's a lot more policing for young Black boys wearing do-rags versus other students wearing baseball caps in schools, right? It's more punishable, it leads to suspension rates. And so that policing that we see happening in a hyper-visible way across the socio-political landscape is also like very much happening on the everyday landscape of the institutions we navigate.
Yeah, and I'm so glad you started kind of like taking us in, I think, the next direction or question that was on my mind that actually does swing back to you, Dr. J, is, I think hopefully like more audiences are getting attuned to the contours of all these types of conversations about like, what does policing and injustice and what does limitation look like in many aspects of our society? And I know perhaps a common through line for all three of us is that as you loft up these types of stories and perspectives to wider audiences, one of the immediate kind of knee-jerk pushbacks are like, okay, so like, what do I do and where do I start? And I'm curious for you, Dr. J, and similarly for you, frankly, too, AT, like when you get that kind of like, okay, this is great, I get it, shit's popping off everywhere, but like, what do I do? Where do I start at? What tends to be some of your kind of guiding principles or suggestions to people when you kind of get that initial kind of reaction?
Yeah, there's always a real complex question about who it is to dismantle white supremacy, particularly. I think about what it takes to become an architect. You don't just architecture one day and say, you know what, I'm gonna just do that. You become a student of architecture. You become you become immersed in the discourse. You become you become apprenticed by the field, right? Your lens is shaped differently. Once you start to study architecture, you literally see the material world differently because you're looking at it through that lens. Now you have a better understanding how to construct type of reality in ways that people don't. And so I think these, like, we got hundreds of years of resources, of literature, of talks, of all kinds of things for you to become a student of, right? If you want to become part of the work of dismantling the systems of injustice and harm that have been acting upon people for so many years, and inscribing and erecting a world that we truly need, become a student of this, live with it, breathe in it, become a part of this course and the labor of it. Usually when people ask me that question, they're looking for like a one sheet, like a bullet point. Like, what do I do? Read this book, go to protests, and follow this person on Twitter. And now you're anti-racist. And it's like, nah, right? This is systemic, this is deep, this is in the fabric of our nation, of our society. And what it takes to become a part of undoing it, it takes you upon yourself to step really fully and boldly into that kind of labor. And so I don't have like a neat answer for people. And I'm also always very clear that it's not Black people's work to tell white people how to dismantle white supremacy as well. So there's that.
AT, did you want to chime in too?
Yeah, absolutely. And I couldn't agree more with everything that Dr. J said. It is truly different for every single person, the contribution that you need to make. The first thing I always recommend to people is, if you are interested in being anti-racist, doing anti-racist work, talk to people. Talk to people who have been working on these problems for decades. Talk to people who have experienced it. Talk to people who are thinking about these things constantly. It is so accessible to find information on the internet, literature, tweets. It is much harder to have a face-to-face conversation. You obviously need to do it in a way that is comfortable and organic, and it doesn't feel like, as Dr. J said, if you are a non-Black person, you're expecting Black people to, inform you about their experiences. But, everyone on this call who is or on this panel rather, is either an educator or has formally educated people. We see that the best way to get through the students is to talk to them, to help them understand, what their role is that they can play whenever they want to work on. And I think it's very similar when you're looking into doing anti-racist work. And for me, I found my, niche in writing. But for any person on this call, that may look very different for you. The only way that you're able to really figure that out is by speaking to people who've been doing the work, doing your diligence, and going about it in a way that is as sincere as possible. If you are someone who doesn't like writing, don't write about police brutality. If you are someone who really cares about food insecurity in the Black community, then you can find many ways to contribute to that are genuine and earnest. There's so many different roles to play in this movement, but it really comes down to you, doing your own work to figure out what's right for you.
I so agree. And for me too, when I'm listening to both of you kind of give your perspectives, is that I think it also underscores the thing that I often say in similar type of talks, is that, you know, if you poll 3 or 4 different Black people, you might get 3 or 4 different answers too, right? And like I know that like one of the things I do DEI work as a day-to-day kind of practice, and one of the things I'm constantly reminding people about is that, you know, this is much more like a much more also about a purpose finding mission, which means that you will potentially encounter some Black people who will say, like, just like Dr. J has said, like, vaya con Dios, but this is not my job to help you figure this out. And you will also potentially run into Black folks who say, like, I see you, let's figure out where to get started and I'll help you as much as I can. And you'll have people who frankly reserve the right to change their mind on any one of those initial stances and pivot in a different direction as they reach different types of epiphany or thresholds. So like also recognizing that a grounding principle around this too is understanding how to like be true to the purpose of what the end goal is for you when you embark on an anti-racism journey, because it means that you're often going to have to stumble at times, you're going to have to get redirected a number of times, and you will have to kind of like vet and find the ways that are going to be important for you to have the tools to do sustainable work around this. You know, I think you all were talking about like, you know, not waiting. Some of what I would paraphrase of what you were always saying is like not waiting for perfection in order to activate change. And I think it's the same. You know, I said in a work world related discussion a couple days ago that in some respect, this is like when you assemble IKEA furniture, like you might want to flip through the whole thing to understand what the process looks like to build, but you don't fundamentally read the whole thing. You have to like do as you're reading along. And I think it's the same as working towards becoming more anti-racist, is that like, yeah, you want to both imbibe a perspective about how to do the thing, but you also need to be doing the thing parallel at the same time too. And I think those, like the notion that there are limited actions or binary choices that you need to make in order to move forward, are also some of the things I think we have to push into people. AT, you were talking a little bit earlier about like finding your niche, and you were saying in particular the idea of writing clearly being one of the ways that you have found your niche. I'm curious if you could talk about like as you have like kind of narrowed down your purpose in terms of writing, what has it meant for you to go on the mission of creating or finding communities of like identities for you to kind of like not only perhaps feel safe and secure and thrive, but also to address many of the issues that we're talking about here? What's that been like for you?
Yeah, absolutely. So, and thank you for that question. Something I think about a lot. I have always thought of writing as a very lonely experience until recently. Partly because writing is something that I've always done outside of my core job. Like I work at a startup. I spend, 10, 11, 12 hours a day doing things that are not related to writing or not always explicitly related to anti-racism. And because of that, I'm finding myself writing in the late hours of the night or on the weekends. And oftentimes that happens without community. I know that there are millions of writers that exist in this country. I know that there are millions of people who care about anti-racism, but still, I took this path that I found to be oftentimes in solitude. But lately, one of the things that I've been doing is engaging people who are close to me more in my writing, and specifically within Black spaces. So to give you an example, I was always very nervous to share my poetry or my essays with my closest friends for no reason beyond it felt like I was exposing part of myself to them that I'd always been very private, and I was almost coming out as a writer, to them. But on my only Black people group chat, I found that they give me not only the best encouragement but the best feedback, the best thoughts, the best perspective on the types of things that I really want my audience to care about, because I'm not writing for a white audience, even though oftentimes these publications cater most to that. I'm writing for people who are like me. I'm writing for people who care about these topics, who are engaging with them, like many people that are in this group chat. One of the things that I've struggled with is finding other writers who do have the same background that I do. Not only are the writers mostly white at the publications where I'm pitching, and Tre and Dr. J, I'm sure you've experienced this as well. The editors are white. The owner of the publication is white. The business side is white. And that comes with even more loneliness at times. And when I am pitching stories that I know are important and I know are going to make a difference to people who are hopefully emboldened by the article to take action, and I'm having a hard time getting across to them, that's when I start to turn to places like Instagram, where I know there is a community of people there who care about these topics, who are going to be less critical or less dismissive than a white editor. That's when I turn to my group chats. Just because you don't feel like just because you don't have access to a certain platform doesn't mean that there aren't people who are willing to engage with your work, who aren't willing to help you build that community, to make sure that you're getting feedback, you're getting encouragement. And, at the end of the day, I think I read once that, the only success metric for writing is that you're still doing it. It's a very, very difficult thing to persist with. And I think the more you have the community, the better you are at continuing to do it.
I want to hear a similar kind of reflection from Dr. J around the same question. But before we do that, like one of the curiosity points I just had about you and your work in particular that I tend to forget about is poetry. Like, why poetry in particular for you? You've brought it up a couple of times already tonight too.
Yeah, absolutely. So poetry is what I love to write the most, and it's what I've been writing for the longest. And poetry that I fell in love with, from a very early age were, poetry by Maya Angelou and Langston Hughes and Claude McKay, and these Black writers who are, doing something radical simply by being a Black poet, but they're infusing that into their work as well. I rarely come back to poems like I Too Sing America by Langston Hughes because it sums up so much of the Black experience in just a few words. The same thing with, Maya Angelou talking about why the caged bird sings. The idea of a caged bird singing for freedom is something that is timeless. And that is, in my opinion, the power of poetry and a lot of literature, is that if it withstands the test of time, which a lot of our favorite poets, their writing does, that means it's applicable, every single time there is an incident that occurs that is relevant to it. Whenever there is a Black person who's killed by police, I Too Sing America is relevant. And when it comes to writing a news article or something that's more timely, you can't always say that. It's often isolated to a specific moment that's happening in the country or in the news. But that timelessness of poetry, I think, is what always has drawn me to it. And on top of that, the shareability. I only started sharing my poetry on Instagram recently, but people have short attention spans. I know I do. And writing short form, whether it's, short form fiction or nonfiction or poetry, allows more people to engage with it simply because of the amount of words on the page. So for people here who have ever considered writing poetry, I couldn't encourage you more. A poem could be absolutely anything. There are no rules. And I think for that, and along with that shareability, it makes it a really, really exciting medium for so many people.
Thank you, AT. Dr. J, kind of similar to you, or back to you, I have both like the question of what does it mean for you? What does it look like for you to curate community? But I also have a second question about what it's like for you when you push your work and messages into separate communities than your own. But let's start first with hearing you talk about too, where's the restorative community that you go to and you've created for yourself to help you stay through in this work?
Okay, yeah. So for me, it's all about building with folks who have shared values. So especially now, we got a country full of Black Lives Matter streets. We got lots of statements and testimonies of lots of things, commitments to anti-racism. We have a lot of people to languaging the of social justice and racial justice, but don't know a lot about the character and value and the why that grounds our institutions, organizations, and the spaces that are making these testimonies. For me, the why of is your value system, and there I find shared community with people who are not just testifying that we're doing the same thing, but that we're organized around the same reason. And so for my example of that, I think about the distinction when people do work with Black youth in particular. I do work with Black youth because I believe that they're genius and brilliant, and that there are systems of power that have continuously harmed and limited that or sought to. And there are other people who are doing it because they believe that they can save those people from themselves. And that's a different why. We might be showing up for the same what, but we have a different why. And I build community, and I find kinship with people who have a vision that is rooted in shared values. So that it doesn't become about the aesthetic of the thing, but about the integrity of the thing. I hope that answers your question.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, I love both of these reflections, and I'm curious as a result then, especially given like such a clear-eyed framework that you have, Dr. J, that touches on a lot of things. When you bring these messages to new audience or different communities, and you have to paint this picture for them around like the idea of like the wider spread system of systemic racism that we all kind of find ourselves caught up in, how do you help people see that picture? Because I think sometimes people get stuck on like the small things or on the individual things. But can you tell us a little bit, like when you bring like your TED Talks and you bring your other kind of like artifacts of proof to people to paint a broader picture, how do you tend to approach that? And what's kind of like the pushback you tend to get, or what does it provoke in people?
Yeah. I mean, going back to an earlier question, like I actually do teach lots of people about anti-racism, right? Like, and you know, that's why this is part of why I'm like, don't just like roll up on people and expect them to teach you something. There are people who do this work. There's knowledge out there. Do your work because you know, I've chosen to do this. And so it's just always a very interesting dynamic, that conversation. But yeah, so for me, I'm all about exposing ideas. I'm always all about to get people to understand what's happening in the moment, what's happening that's highly politicized and polarizing. I'm like, let's historicize this. Let's historicize and let's think about the ideologies that are shaping what we're thinking about in this moment. So for me, and I'll give countless examples, right? So I shared earlier about the Crown Act. There are young people, I know two young girls in particular in Malden, Massachusetts, who were suspended, received detention, and couldn't go to prom because they had box braids in their hair, which is a Black cultural hairstyle, right? They got suspended because there's a policy that says that there's no foreign substance that can be in your hair, or whatever policy is literally against their hairstyle, right? What logic is organized around what hairstyles are appropriate or not appropriate for school? Like once we start to ask those questions, we start to understand who and what is privileged in this country. Because how are you going to tell me that my hairstyle is not appropriate? Who's determining these things? We understand that the hairstyles that are appropriate for school and the workplace are often hairstyles that are white. And then we understand that that is not ahistorical, that there are historical ideologies around the policing of Black bodies and Black identities that feed directly into what we normalize and standardize and institutionalize. And so we start to go down this path and we start to say, it's not about the event. That's a polarizing. You're like, oh, they should have known better. That's kind of the feedback. They should have read the policy. They should have known, like, but the policy's racist. How do we know? Because we can historicize it. We can start to ask questions about what ideologies shape what is normalized and standardized there, and who that includes and who that excludes. So we start to go down that path, it starts to illuminate for people like, okay, this is very much connected to a particular logic and lens about what's privileged and valued, and what is disparaged and treated as delinquent just by nature of existing. And I don't get a lot of pushback when I do that work because there's not much you can say, right? It's you know, if you didn't want to believe it, you're not going to believe it, but it's very obvious. It's not really the kind of thing that has many sides to it, because it's very fundamental questions when we start to do that systemic level work.
Total pivot question for both of you that there's just and it's an admittedly like somewhat random question, but I think it hits on some of what does the application of this stuff look like in some of our contemporary conversations. How have you all approached, if it's been brought to you, or even if it hasn't, like how have you all engaged with the conversation around cancel culture, which I think hits at some of the intersections of what we're talking about in terms of addressing systemic issues, places of power, cultures of power, language of power, and such. What's kind of like the back of a napkin like response or stance that you have around cancel culture? And like, since I put y'all on the spot, I will also offer my own answers as well too. But like, I'm just curious how you all respond to that.
Yeah, I have a really tough time with this debate because Black people have been canceled for centuries. When we think about cancel culture, I think that the way that it's used colloquially typically refers to people who are in power, and oftentimes white people who have wealth and power, who are the ones who are canceled. We don't talk about Kaepernick as being canceled, even though that is essentially what happened to him. So I oftentimes find myself dismissing this debate because it's not relatable to everyday people. Because of that, I sort of steer clear of it, but which might be a bit of a cop out. I think in general, I, in principle, don't like the idea that no one can be forgiven for something. But in practice, I think we have to hold people accountable. And if you are a public figure, part of your responsibility is to listen to people when they are showing up to hold you accountable to actions that you've made. And for most people who are quote unquote canceled, who fall into that celebrity realm, which they often do, their cancellation has almost no material impact on their wealth, on their influence, on their power. Oftentimes, their cancellation just emboldens their fan base, or it gives them more opportunities to speak to press and get their name out there and build their brand. So I have yet to see, a person who is complaining about cancel culture because they were canceled, who has had their life ruined. But someone like Kaepernick, if he didn't have the community behind him that he did, his whole life, everything would have been on the line for him, and it has been. It's really, really hard for me to engage in these conversations because I really do think it applies mostly to wealthy white people.
Totally agreed. I try to avoid the conversation as well. Like, you knew that blackface was racist. Like, stop. Oh, whoops. No, sometimes I just really think it's like trolling. Like, it's a publicity stunt at this point. The thought that so many offensive things can happen and someone can come back and say they didn't know is just it's offensive and disheartening, right? Because it's just like, well, what have we been talking about all this time if you're so privileged that you didn't know that it wasn't okay to put someone in blackface as a part of your advertisement, right? I don't even believe any of it. And at the same time, I struggle with the fact that I believe in restorative justice. I believe in healing. I believe in humanity and wholeness and a vision of hope. And so there are some people that are like really canceled for me. Like, I'm just like, you can't tell me any different. That's just that. But at the end of the day, I find myself not believing that there's a genuinely repentant spirit most of the time. And much of the time, I feel like there's a lot of publicity stunts and weird energy, like AT shared, around the kind of platform that you get and how you become emboldened once you say, oh, whoops, sorry, I didn't know. It's very silly. So I try to stay clear of the conversation as well.
I'm not super different than either one of y'all. Like, I similarly don't engage with it. I actually, in many ways, think it's not real. I think it's a fabrication of like internet, social media culture more than anything else. I think it's, we've been using the word niche a lot, and I've often said that I think it's a bigger term than it is an actual practice. I think it's actually a very niche group of people that actively operate around the tenets of it. I also think too, like some of what I've heard you both think about in terms of your orientation around it kind of pushes into one of the other thoughts I have, which is that there's one of the limitations around it too, is that there doesn't seem to even be a fixed definition around it. I think there's it often means many things to many people in many different types of contexts. And so it's even hard to pinpoint what cancel culture really is. And yeah, like, I think some of what you all touched on too is that it's something I definitely grapple with, and maybe that's why I don't deeply engage with it, because I fundamentally believe in, largely because I'm Black, like I know what the validity is around an arc of redemption and forgiveness, and or at least a reevaluation of what truth looks like in a lot of contexts. And I know that that is short shrifted to folks like us a lot. But but then there's also some trash situations where I'm like, oh no, like I don't even know what it means for me to hold cancel culture right now, but I know that that is the thing I'm going to use right now to like excise this particular person or thing from my life, and it just reinforces to me like I don't think it's even a question of cancel culture for me. It is more like what do my when presented with situations or people that feel aggressively against the grain of like what I believe about my values or humanity, how do I choose to hold or not hold them? And again, like I think it's like I don't think these things last long, and I think there is the opportunity to have a reestablished relationship with many things that you have chosen to cancel at different points in time too. So I want to thank you both for like even indulging that question, because I think it can be a tough one to have an honest answer about, but also walk the line around in a lot of ways. I know I want to be mindful about our time here, and I just saw Anderson's lovely face just pop back up on video, so I'm guessing that is the
thank you so much, Tre,
great.
Dr. J,
Yeah.
AT. Thank you all so much. You always do such a great job. I did have one question, selfishly, before we turn it over to the audience. And audience, please, if you have a question to ask any one of our panelists, please raise your hand and we'll allow you to ask the question. But while they're doing that, I was wondering if any of you all can just speak about the intersection between literature and community to create change.
Just something light, just like a real light
just something we can take. There's something that we can give everyone, because we're talking about using, advancing anti-racism through literature.
Yeah.
Right. And I want to give the people something to kind of go away with, especially when we think about our ways that we can use our community. And literature to build the change.
No, I feel you. But I'm thinking about Toni Morrison comes to mind just because her work has been such has played such a substantial role in the way that I envision community change. I'm thinking about what it means to think about the literature that equips us with the visioning and the dreaming of the kind of liberation and social interrogation that we know we cannot always accomplish in real time. And that's what becomes really powerful about the literary landscape. And similarly, the poetic landscape, right? We're able to name things in ways that we cannot necessarily name. This is the power of art, right? To be able to actualize, to ask questions. What Toni Morrison will do is engage us in historical fiction and will like really put us in a position of thinking about, well, what is the blueprint for the kind of world that we need to imagine and manifest? For me particularly, I'm thinking about Beloved, right? Which is set in the early postbellum South. And in the early postbellum South, the protagonists in Beloved are really taking up the question, what does it mean to be free, right? So one of the characters says, freeing yourself is one thing, but claiming ownership of that freed self is another. And I'm like, yo, like, talk about timeless. What is it? I've literally, since encountering that text, lived my life with the question, what does it mean to claim ownership of my freed self? It's not enough to be freed. It means it's the work of claiming ownership of that freedom and asserting it as a lens and an opportunity and tool for disruption. And that's invited by what Toni Morrison explores in the landscape of that literature. So for me, especially when it comes to Black literature, it's the blueprint. It's the blueprint for things that we would not have otherwise imagined.
Nice. Thank you so much, Dr. J. AT, you have something to add on that?
Yeah, I mean, I couldn't agree more. I often find that the authors in my life that I turn to the most are almost like mentors or, aunts or uncles or some wise figure in my life who I can think about a quote or a passage, and that can guide my decision making. And I think that the power of literature, I think, really is at least twofold for me. One is it allows you to truly empathize with different people. For me, it means empathizing with different types of Black people, oftentimes, and for others, it means like taking a look at what the experiences are of those who are different from you, and that is always going to be a crucial part of learning, and also unlearning different racist tendencies that you have. And the second piece for me really is similar to what I said about poetry, is that timelessness. One of those quotes that we all return to, or many of us return to constantly, is, your silence will not protect you, Audre Lorde, right? I think about that quote every single time I have an inkling of a feeling to not speak up. And when that quote crosses my mind, I recognize that if I stay silent in that moment, like, I will not feel better. I may in fact feel worse. And I, rely on Audre Lorde, I rely on James Baldwin, I rely on all the greats, for those reasons, because, those sound bites that play back and forth in your head, those are the ones that, are truly timeless, and remind us, how to behave, how to act as people in a racist society.
And if I could, I would just add in one other thing around all this too, because I so agree with Dr. J and AT. And two things I would quickly say. One is that we have consistently known that literature has a powerful impact on society, which is why we have seen so many Black stories excised or prevented from being a part of established canons and curriculums. There's inherent power and danger into bringing in the other perspective in a lot of things. And I would also say too, the reminder here that there's always a sweet intersection between just art in general and community change. I think in particular around I very much view the act of what Bree Newsom did, climbing the pole and removing the flag. That was an art performance that provoked a whole societal change in conversation about what it does take and mean to remove particular types of symbols. And in that same vein, that symbols that are erected around all of our towns and cities that were created as works of art have the potential to send consistent signals to society all the time. And we need to have an inverted relationship around what our relationships look like with different types of art inside of society that are already established, and put in new art in as many places as possible, because they do change perspective and provoke new conversations and change in people.
Nice. Well, Tre, I want to kick this next question off to you, and I'm going to kind of weave it in with Mark Nelson's question. So, we started off the series with your article, when Black people are in pain, white people just join book clubs. And thinking about Mark's question, how do we alter the mass hypnosis of society? I was wondering if you can answer that, and if you all can kind of answer after him, but I wanted to start off with you, Tre.
I I do this, and I do this work at as many different angles as possible. And I think my general attitude is that's the exact same thing people in society have to do. You have to be willing to address it replete throughout your life. And so this idea of mass hypnosis, another very small question to ask at the tail end of a long evening. But I think a lot of this is about, I always go back to a couple of things. One is the importance of art. So I think not just the introduction of art, but the meaningful relationship and engagement that you do with art as a result, whether that is with books, whether that is with paintings, whether it's with movies. But it's about as you have epiphanies that are activated inside of you and inside of groups that you are around, what does it compel you to do as a different course of action than what you're doing the day before or the hour before you engage with this thing? Art is meaningless as an epiphany if it does not compel you to be accountable to doing something different when presented with a choice and option to do something different. The other thing I would say too is that we have to explicitly look at every sort of policy that is actively hindering the Black experience in America. And that's everything from education funding to housing to incarceration and the like. And then I think the last thing I would quickly say is that, I do think so much of this stuff is about healing and about therapy. And I think a lot of this is about people being able to and comfortable to audit the background traumatic experiences that they have either been a direct actor in or an adjacent actor in when the result has been the harm of any type of marginalized person, because I think this extends to beyond just the Black experience as well, but also to like when we think about so many people in the queer community too, like there are so many things that we have all been directly complicit in or adjacent to that has harmed people. And I think you have to audit your own background to figure out where are the tender spots that you need to change. And then lastly, I would just say reparations. Reparations, reparations, reparations.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. Thanks, Tre. AT, Dr. J, either any one of you can take it on, or unless if you all like Tre's response, then I'll ask you an even loaded question that you can answer since you all have all the answers.
I can quickly build on that. So, I couldn't agree more that policy is important to change if we want to de-hypnotize the society. I think that people oftentimes assume that, policies and laws reflect, what societal values are. But I think that happens in the inverse as well. When you're born into a country, those policies impact, your beliefs and your values. If we decided that we wanted to adopt more socialist policies, we will raise a generation of people who understand that as, a type of generosity that is governmental, that also means that they perhaps as an individual could be more generous. If we adopt reparations-based policies, that means that people will grow up in this country understanding that some type of financial or moral recompense needs to happen for people who've been harmed. Right now, we don't have many of those things at all. Instead, we have policies that encourage competition to a fault. And therefore, we are raising children, we are raising adults in this country to chase things that are a reflection of those policies. So, this is why we vote. This is why we need to elect the right people into the right positions. But I truly think that until those policies change, like the society won't conform to them.
Thanks so much, JT. I have one last question. This one is from Lydia. She says, how can high school English teachers advance anti-racism through literature? Are there some practical guidelines to follow? Is it different for a white teacher to do this work? And anyone can answer.
I'm a teacher educator, and definitely I was an English major and studied English education, all that stuff. There are definitely a lot of tools out there for the way that anti-racism occurs in the English classroom. Particularly for me, the kinds of texts that are centered within an English classroom, the kind of language practices, when the world of the text that, we just spoke about the magnitude of impact that literature has on society. When the world of the texts that are centered in your classroom space is completely divorced from the world of the reality that the students are navigating, then there has to be work that is done, right? Like, what are the ways that if you have students who are, if you have a lot of Black students, what are the ways that you are supporting how they enter into a particular text that might be different from them? What background knowledges, what histories, what worlds do they navigate that are valid and beautiful and powerful that can be in conversation with the texts that are there, if there are similarities or differences? Like, that kind of work has to happen, because often what we do in English classrooms is, first of all, we're forced to teach to the test. And so most of what we're doing is equipping young people with the canonical knowledge that they need to perform on a test. And that canonical knowledge, if it's Black students, doesn't represent them. If you're working with white students, probably represents them, but misrepresents our social reality and teaches them that they are privileged and at the center of a reality, and that's harm. And so what does it mean to really think about the full personhood of every single student that comes into your classroom, and how that can overlap within a diverse array of texts that can expose students with a very diverse world, to a diverse world. Like, I teach courses on this. It's hard to capture in like the last few minutes of this thing, but I'm very passionate about the English classroom in particular. And I'd be happy if you shoot me an email to share some resources on the way that anti-racism functions in English classrooms.
Dr. J, thank you so much for just making yourself so available like that. And again, sorry for the loaded questions 2 minutes before we're going to cut off. I was going to ask you guys how to solve racism, but I'll defer to the next time. So we have just one quick announcement from Anna, and I just want to tell you all, thank you so much for an amazing evening. I can't wait to post this and just dissect it all over again. But Anna, I'll kick it off to you, and thank you all again.
Thanks, Anderson, Dr. J, AT, Tre. Before I do a little closeout announcement from book clubs, I just want to give you the floor. If there's one final thing that you'd like to say in the waning seconds, please go for it. And if not, I'll close things out. Okay, then I'm going to close things out with 2 announcements and a thank you. One, this was the first series we did on advancing anti-racism through literature. It is certainly not the last. We're gonna continue this. We're gonna learn from what happened this fall and hopefully improve things and have even greater reach going into 2021. So I hope you'll continue to follow us. This event and our previous events were recorded and they're up on our YouTube channel. So share broadly. I think the whole world needs to tune in to this conversation. And so that's one announcement. The other is that as Anderson alluded to, this whole thing really got kicked off by Tre's article this summer. And so Tre has been such an integral part of this series, these events. Tre, we have so much gratitude for you and what you've brought to book clubs in our community. When we started this, there are over 100,000 people that use book clubs for their book club. And this summer, in 1 month, we saw 350 book clubs form as anti-racist book clubs, which was amazing and inspiring. And the intention, I think, of all of these clubs is laudable and great. And they recognize the importance of literature and art in this movement and in this fight. But we also all read Tre's article and shared that with our community. And it was a moment to reflect on, okay, maybe this is a starting point, or I see this as important, but as Dr. J, you so eloquently shared with us, there's a discourse beyond reading what happens in one book club to immerse ourselves in. And in that discourse, opportunities for action and recognizing the oppressive and racist systems and policies we're living in are revealed and uncovered. And I just want to thank you all for being a part of that tonight, and for the attendees, stick with us. There's more to come next year. So happy holidays all, and thanks again.
Yes, happy holidays.
Thanks for having me, and thanks for this work. Bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye, everyone.